He really is like wise beyond his years in a lot of ways, and I enjoyed that. Let's talk about our first draft prospect.
A player the Wizards may or may not be in position to draft.
Yeah, and that's Zaccharie Risacher, who I saw at last year's Hoop Summit for the first time. What are the basics on him?
Unfortunately, because Risacher's team is still playing, we do not have updated measurements on him. So I'm going to use what they had at the Hoop Summit, and that was 6'9" and a half, 193 pounds, with a 6'10" and a half wingspan, 8'10" standing reach. Um, if you want physical comps, it's actually unusual to have a guy that height who has a wingspan that's only +1. So there aren't great comps. Zaire Williams is actually a guy who had a smaller wingspan than you think. Um, and then most of the guys who do have that are way heavier. So like the Morris twins and Blake Griffin, they actually have those basic dimensions, except they're like 30 to 50 pounds bigger than Risacher when they were drafted. And then Paul George is actually vaguely in the area, but he was heavier too. And there's some other stuff with him. So there aren't really many comps. Brief bio for Risacher. French national, dad played on the 2000 French silver medal Olympic team. And he's been in the youth program for I always just use the acronym ASVEL, which is one of the other significant programs in France. I think they're fourth right now in the French league. First year on a pro contract was this year, though he's been in the youth system since 2020. And Risacher, the second youngest player to be named the Euro Cup Rising Star this year, as Bourg, his team that he's on loan with, reached the finals. And then he also was chosen as the French league's, I think, like young player of the year, whatever their equivalent is. But that's not necessarily a huge prize, because even though France has a number of guys that are high in this draft, Risacher is the one with the profile, and Alex Sarr is playing in Australia, not in France.
Yeah, that physical profile is really interesting because, of course, you're drafting him this high, thinking he could be one of these prototypical wings. And yeah, so he's thin. I don't know if would fill out enough to really play much for. He's been doing that some for his team there. But there aren't many like true wings in the French league. Like if they were true wings, they would just be in a better league,
True.
as we conceive of them in the NBA. So yeah, there. When you think of a guy who's got he's sort of like one of these do everything type of wings, and we'll talk about how good he is at all of those things going forward here. But yeah, in terms of the physical aspect, I would say like him not having elite length does kind of show up to me, and not having an elite standing reach. It's not like terrible, but it's again, he's not one of these guys who you see him out there and like, oh, this is one of these rangy wing types. But when you look at now, he also is 6'10", right? He's taller than a lot of these guys too, although he doesn't necessarily have as big of a wingspan. And, the standing reach is just kind of right, about normal for this player type. And, I think he'll put on, like, I don't think he's going to be like a weakling or anything, but like I said, he's probably a little bit below like where you'd want a combo forward type of guy to be.
Like as an example, granted, you're playing against grown men in the French league. The times that Risacher was primarily guarding power forwards, he was getting bullied a little bit. And these are French league power forwards. These are not NBA power forwards. And so there is a margin there, like there is at the 3. And so Risacher, he is 19, born April 2005. This will be his age 19 season. There's actually older guys in this class than Risacher, even if they're like one and done equivalents. So that does bode for him. But as you said, he doesn't have the frame to me to be a lot heavier. He can gain some. But he does make up for some of that in other ways. But as you mentioned, it's not through wingspan or anything like that.
Yeah, physically, I do think he is the type who could improve his athleticism. I'd say he's not the greatest leaper off of 2 feet, but I think he does get off the ground reasonably quickly. Like he can get a few shot blocks here and there. Off of 1 foot, like he's got pretty decent bounce, but not elite. The other thing that stuck out to me, in addition to the wingspan being pretty average, is his hands appear to be absolutely tiny because the ball just slips out of his hands going for dunks all the time. I will
Yeah.
laud
Oh,
him for
I
being
actually have a
pretty
stat on that.
aggressive. Oh, great. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. So on synergy, right? Yeah. I should have looked at this. What did he shoot on dunks this year?
He was 45 of 56, so that's 80% on dunks.
Yeah.
I was watching this morning. I was watching the game they played against Monaco over the weekend, and he totally bricked a dunk in transition. Just like, oh, that's weird.
Yeah, I watched that one too, and I was just like, well, it wasn't weird anymore. I'd seen it happen so many. I mean, just anytime he tries to go up to finish with one hand, like the ball can just like squirt out of his hands. And he would try to get these dunks, and it just like he would miss because the ball was like starting to come out of his hands. As someone who has hands that were not huge for palming the ball, and would try to dunk with one hand, I had that happen to me all the time, so I know how it feels. Uh, and you definitely like the way that you missed the dunk, like it can kind of look like you just missed it, but it's because you didn't have a great grip on the ball. And yeah, from a strength standpoint, I think he'll be adequate at small forward, probably a little below average at the four. I do think he's pretty fast in a straight line, and like that's something interesting, whether it's running the floor, his acceleration, like if he's breaking on a ball in the passing lanes, is pretty good.
The
They
word
run him off a lot of screens.
the word I think I have 4 times in my notes with Risacher as an athlete is fluidity. I think that he's not
Yeah.
a dominant athlete, but he's a very fluid athlete. And what I mean by that is that he can transition between phases well, and his acceleration is pretty good, even if his top speed and his explosion is not like otherworldly like some other guys we've talked about in the past.
Yeah, and you do have to be a little careful because the level of athleticism in this league is not as high. So if he's like,
Right.
running way faster than some of these other guys, you got to take that a little bit of a grain of salt. What did you make of his lateral movement defensively?
Okay, not phenomenal. I thought that there are times where Risacher is like I think that his mind sometimes gives his body a little bit of latitude in the French league. I'm not sure it'll do that, but I thought it was okay.
Yeah, I it was interesting because the way that he played, I felt like he had some nice moments when he was cutting guys off. He would defend, smaller guards a reasonable amount. Not like he wasn't getting beaten, but he also would kind of play more of like a contain style, and not having the greatest wingspan, guys could usually like get separation against him for the jumper, even if they're a little shorter. But he did have some moments where he really moved his feet, and he doesn't get into like the deepest stance again. Like he's just like a little bit more upright of a mover, and I thought like in that aspect in particular, he did remind me of fellow Frenchman Nick Batum, who I think there are definitely some analogs between those two guys. But Nick Batum, like if you watch him play defense, he generally is not like sliding with the guy and like cutting him off with his chest going laterally. He almost just kind of runs alongside him, which is actually not the worst way to defend, particularly when you're defending a guy off of screens. But I did think that he had some moments where he could move laterally, and I wanted to see what it would look like if he like got into the ball a little bit more, and that could also maybe help him with not having the biggest wingspan. So I think there could be a little bit more to explore there. Although my kind of default is he was solid, but not someone who's going to be a stopper. I think given that he's not like the most sudden athlete, not necessarily that strong, I think he's probably more of like an adequate defender on the wing.
He and this is another guy that I'm going to bring up a few times with Risacher. At times, the defensive film, like in terms of like the applied athleticism, reminded me a little bit of Brandon Miller, where it's like, okay, you could be a part of the system, but you're not the shutdown guy yourself. And that is a fine place to be. You'd love for everybody to be the wing defender for the Stars. That's the dream. But as if you could be a competent guy who could take on those assignments, and then that gives the team latitude to play you, and you can kind of work through it from there. And so for Risacher, and there were also
Yeah.
times where
Well,
he
let's save that Miller comparison to the end, because when we kind of wrap up, I that was another one that came to mind for me as well, and I do think that's a very useful comparison point for him.
sure.
So let's put a pin in that one.
I like the way, and just because this is the first one we do, You and I discuss absolutely nothing about any prospect before we talk about them, for the reason that it leads to a better conversation.
Since we started talking about, let's finish up with talking about some of his defense then, since we're on the subject.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've started watching on Synergy every player is their blocks and their steals. And I liked Risacher's blocks more than his steals because there were a couple plays where it was more than like right place, right time. Like he reacted well, he got to the spot, and even if his wingspan isn't great, especially if it's kind of going up against guard, he can make some things happen there. Didn't have he only has 19 credited blocks on the year, and Risacher has played in 64 French league games this year, including their like tournament stuff and everything else like that. And there are a few plays where you see it where like there were a few where it's like it looked more like what you see a power forward do in supplemental rim protection, where like coming over from the opposite side and bothering a shot and everything else like that. And I think of Risacher as at least beginning his career as a 3 rather than a 4, but it wouldn't stun me, especially if you're talking more in bench units where you kind of can shift things around a little bit. The other team isn't challenging you at the rim as consistently in a lot of second units, that he could play some 4 and fulfill some of those responsibilities.
Yeah, as I noted earlier, he gets off the ground quickly, but he doesn't get up that high, I would say. So he was able to kind of surprise some guys, like, or if guards were trying to get to the basket against him, could run alongside him and block their little hook shot along the lane line. Um, and I thought his activity level was excellent. I
Yes.
think there were uh, maybe I couldn't really think of a moment where I was like, "Oh, this guy's just not playing hard." Like he just didn't give the effort on that play. I don't know if you agree with that, but
I do.
that was that was my feeling. I mean, he just clearly has had like a good basketball tutelage and was an effective player in the French league, playing against good teams. Like his weak side activity, it wasn't always perfect, but generally he was pretty solid, making the rotations that needed to be made. His steals, you mentioned those, most of them were accelerating in a straight line to intercept a pass to the weak side in the passing lanes. And that's kind of more of a gambling style where you can get beat a few times, although I didn't see too many of those from him. But yeah, I felt he did a pretty good job of fulfilling help responsibilities. Just a good team defender, good feel. Is he, and I don't think he'll be a lead at like those kind of low man responsibilities. I think he's, solid closing out, but not just like, terrifying guys on these closeouts with how fast he's running them off the line, like Jaden McDaniels style or something like that. So I guess where I ultimately come down on his defense is, yeah, like you were saying, that not your number one defender. Like maybe there's a slight possibility he could get to that level if he can kind of harness this quickness a little bit more and get a little bit stronger and improve his technique. I don't think so. I think he's more kind of just like solid playoff ball. Think of like, well, he won't be as strong as this guy, but kind of like think of maybe what Gordon Hayward was as a defender at his back when he was decent, right? But not someone you're going to put on the best opposing wing, nor are you going to put him on the best point guard. And so when we talk about his ultimate role, that's kind of my feeling. Do you have anything to add to those observations?
I thought that he played well, just a little bit as a team defender. And so one thing I
Yeah.
noticed was I watched the game when they played Cholet in December, and I liked Risacher better in the full game film rather than the individual defensive possession, because you could kind of watch him a little bit more. And I thought that
Yeah.
he's active mentally. When we get more in the offense, I'll talk about that, how that applies. It's a little bit different there. But I like it. I'm not surprised that his dad was a successful player in his own right and everything else, because he's like, for a 19-year-old, it seems like he's very aware, intent, and active physically and mentally, which is a really good sign for a kid that young.
Yeah, and that does show off, I would say, show up on the offensive end as well. This is what I wanted to ask you. Let's start with right now. What is he best at right now?
Offensively,
Maybe we should hit some of the stats on him first, and then we can get into that. I
sure, sure,
suppose would
sure.
probably be better.
So, the overall like per game stats for Risacher, only playing 23 minutes a game, so these are going to seem low, but that's because he's only playing 23 minutes per game. 11 points, 4 rebounds, about an assist, a steal, and half a block per game. But then 39% on 3.5 threes per game. Again, talking about the sample size. 47% from the field. So that means 56% true shooting on 22.5 usage. That's where you get there. And so for me, there are a couple of different contenders. But if we're going based on kind of like what he did for Borg, I would say it was probably the version of the catch and shoot / spot up jumper. I'll talk about what happened when he drove off spot ups later.
How
But
many humans did he assimilate for Borg?
I still haven't watched Next Generation, buddy. It may happen
Well,
this summer.
I can assure you that some of our listeners have.
Oh,
We got much, plenty of nerds in
oh yeah.
our
Oh no.
in our
It
listenership.
may be on the off season list. But so for and what some of the things that I thought was interesting. So I watched a lot of Risacher's film about a month ago is when I really started watching him. And when I watched the Monaco game today, I even thought his jump shot looked better now than it did then. And it was to the point that I noticed it. And I'm like, oh, it looks better. There was a play earlier in the film where Risacher hit a no dip, or he took a no dip corner three. He missed it, but it's like, oh, okay. So like his release is pretty good. I think is like I'm not the expert in this, but like his lower body seemed consistent. So I don't think of him as like the best catch and shoot guy I've ever seen or anything like that. But for a player who does other things well, I think I trust his jump shot.
Yeah, and I thought his jumper looked, it wasn't perfectly developed, but he looked very comfortable taking shots at the Hoop Summit last year in the practices, and it showed some ball handling ability as well. But that was probably one of the bigger things, and to me, and yeah, 38% from three, pretty decent volume, like pretty decent versatility. 71% from the free throw line is not great. That's about where he's been his whole career.
Yeah,
In the various,
and on that front, Risacher shot 31% on threes last season, 32% 2 years ago. So there's a little bit of a concern that this year is the anomaly. But I think his shot looks good.
Yeah, I think it does, right? I mean, if we want to talk about that, wasn't the biggest thing that stood out to me, but since we're on the subject, I think like on his catch and shoots, and is actually somewhat Batum-like as well, although obviously later in Batum's career, of just being able to catch the ball at the letters and just go straight up with it immediately. Like he's getting the ball off pretty well, and he has some pretty decent versatility to his jump shot, and so I think he's gonna be an elite shooter. No, I wouldn't rule it out, but again, that would be a very high-end outcome. Like I think he'll be reliable. Maybe even the type of guy that you could run a few plays for, some shooting sets for. I think it's kind of interesting to talk about how he was used. Obviously, he's very good in transition. Most of what they ran set plays for him was a wide pin down out of the left corner, and he was very good out of that set. I thought they usually got a pretty good look there, and he was able to either turn the corner if the guy trailed, or read it, pop back out, shoot the three if the guy kind of went under to meet him on the other side. So that looked pretty good. And then what I thought his elite skill was, and this is hopefully not too small for a guy we're talking about maybe getting drafted in the top 5 and possibly higher, but he was one of the best prospects I've ever seen in terms of just his footwork and decision making, attacking closeouts. He would make the decision instantly. Generally, at the moment he's catching the ball, he's either shooting it immediately, or if that's not there, going into some type of a move and maybe even a counter move as well. And, just meeting the ball on the move to start a drive, or faking one way, going the other. There's one play that I thought was fantastic where he catches the ball and is basically already starting his sidestep. The guy stays with him, so then he puts the ball on the floor on a left to right crossover and beats him going right instead. And I think he actually pulled up for a mid-ranger out of that. But he really just keeps the machine moving. Like that's something that obviously has really been drilled into him. And with his feel, He just makes really good decisions on the backside of the play when he has any kind of space.
I like that you brought that up, and Risacher, like it connects. I brought up his mental approach a lot, and what I found watching the film on him, and this is going to connect to a more outlandish thing that I have about him, is that he understands what his kind of niche is and was finding ways to like optimize within it. And like the type of thing that you don't generally see a young guy do, where it's like he thought more about how to attack those closeouts than the average person who takes those even at a professional level. And to do that at 19 is really impressive. I will note that Risacher only about 0.64 points per possession on drives, which is really bad. But in part that's because he's not a great finisher. We've talked about some of the limitations there already with the small hands. And when, so like the note that I have in there is that he does two dribbles into good decision, but the good decision is almost always a pass for him right now because of that limited finishing. And also, Risacher, the numbers on it, I'll get into it a little bit more later. The numbers on pull up twos for him are actually pretty ghastly. And I have some theories for why that's the case. But the kind of the processing, the evaluation, that is really good. And actually, I'll transition that into the thing that I thought was funny. So, I knew a little bit about Risacher before watching the film. I'm like, oh, because I had heard something about like a little bit of nascent creation, kind of that kind of stuff with him. And first of all, Borg didn't ask him to do with that a whole hell of a lot. He'd had 7 isolations, including passes, the entire year, and only 38 possessions in pick and roll, including passing. And the numbers aren't fantastic in those. A point per possession, including passes, that's 44th percentile on synergy. But when I watched the film, what I saw was a player who should have done that more and has the capacity to be a second side guy. He's largely unproven in that vein, but like he finds the roll man pretty well. He and both in terms of like getting the angle right, but also like the evaluation, the velocity, all that kind of stuff. And he has some craft using the screen, but a lot of room for improvement. But the lack of elite physical tools, including like a great handle, like his handle's better than you'd expect, but it's not elite. And he's not. We've said that I used him as a fluid athlete, not a dominant athlete. So the idea being that you're probably not going to run your offense through Zaccharie Risacher. But if you have another guy that you can play off and at 6'9", you almost always are, then I think he can do more in those circumstances as an evaluator and kind of creating things than he has been asked to do so far.
Yeah, I do think his passing can get better. And, as a connector, I think he could be good. He didn't do hardly any isolation. I was just kind of struck of like, all right, how is this guy going to create an advantage for you? And I think the most likely outcome is that someone else is just going to have to create the advantage. Like the only way I see that he's going to be like a really premium option there is if he just becomes like an unbelievable shooter and then also gets like a really good at sort of those like in between floaters or jumpers, maybe like over smaller players or something like that. Because I do think like for being 6'10", like his handle is excellent and he is pretty good with it in transition. He showed off some interesting moves at speed, like going behind his back or between his legs, where you're like, wow, he didn't even slow down at all. Like, that's pretty impressive. But generally, particularly in the half court, anytime he tried to get separation when he didn't have it coming off a screen, just didn't work at all. And like he would just get cut off, and like he had all these moves, but he just like wasn't going anywhere. And and he can't really like kind of use his strength to get by guys. And even in the pick and roll, he's not really that kind of like bendy guy. He's not shifty from side to side. Like you can't envision him sort of like, snaking the pick and roll, getting to his spot. Like I just don't think that's going to be something that you're going to look at from him. So yeah, I mean, run a play for him on that wide pin down. Sure. Like to try to get him ahead of steam going in the lane. He can make a decision. Maybe he can get better at finishing, or he can, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but or his floater game will get good, or he'll get better at like finding the big for a dump off. Like he did have like some nice, his best pick and roll stuff, as you noted, was like finding guys in little slips to the rim out of if the other team was switching or putting 2 on the ball or something. But like any sort of a conventional pick and roll defense, I didn't with the guy in a drop. I just didn't really think he was able to show much, and I think it's telling that they just never gave him the ball in those circumstances, despite the fact he was playing a lot and had a relatively high usage.
The one thing that I think is a little bit intriguing for Risacher in that form is that because of his size, the players who would typically be guarding him aren't necessarily familiar with or great at navigating pick and rolls. So, like the idea of running like a 4-2 or a 4-3 or a 4-5 or like or 3-5, I guess, for primary playing at small forward. A lot of those guys aren't great at navigating it. And if Risacher is not your team's best offensive player, then we're talking like the third or fourth best perimeter defender sometimes. Then maybe you can get into a little bit there and use some of that craft to like get a half step. But then, as you mentioned, like he's not a great finisher and everything else. So I think there's some potential there, but I wouldn't be drafting him with the idea that he's going to be doing that day one or even on day 701.
You said you wanted to talk more about his jump shot off the dribble.
The numbers on it are pretty terrible. And so overall, he shot identical 8 of 27. So that's 29% for those of you scoring at home on pull up twos and pull up threes. And some of them looked good. Like there would be like a nice step back every once in a while. Also, weirdly, Risacher had some bankers from mid range, which is not a shot you generally see from anyone, much less a 6'9" three. But there were some air balls. There were some where I'm just like, because I was at first I saw that number before I saw all of the film, and then I started watching a lot of them, and I was like, I just don't think he has that in his arsenal yet. Now, I do not think that Risacher that he's doomed in that respect or anything like that. And really, that shot, the pull up two, when you consider that he's not great at getting all the way up to the rim, that would be a potential swing skill for him offensively, because if that shot comes, then you have to stay a little bit closer, and then the change in speeds and some of the other stuff could actually work a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think he's kind of more comfortable shooting off the catch, like most guys are. And like the jumper is, when he has to actually jump, like he can shoot on the way down sometimes, which doesn't look great. And that's something he just has to improve his technique on. And so, and then in terms of the finishing, the floaters, I thought there were some moments there. He has a pretty decent left hand. And then same thing on the shots at the rim. Like I thought he got maybe a little better as the year went along. He started to use his body better. I do think he's going to really struggle at first, particularly against NBA level of rim protection, because he's not really going to like use his strength. He doesn't really have any sort of like foul drawing craft or anything of that ilk. Like he's going to just like really go a million miles an hour towards the rim and probably like lose the ball on the way up or get it blocked. Like he is aggressive. Like he was able to finish in transition. I think he's better. So I don't think he's going to be like hopeless finishing at the rim or anything like that, but it's going to take him some time. And I don't think he's going to be an elite option there. Like he can kind of, he can come down a crowded lane and dunk it, but he's not going to do that if someone's like actually there and dunk it on somebody unless that guy's a guard.
There was a play in that Monaco game, I'm sure you noticed it, where if we watched the same one, where he did a coast-to-coast evolving dunk, but I'm like, why didn't anybody pick him up? If somebody would have picked him up, it probably wouldn't have worked as well. Both that one and there was another one. I have two separate bold underline of him going behind the back in transition at almost full speed. It's just a move that you almost never see. And for somebody who's 6'9", it's really interesting. So you get some of those, but then and is there anything more nippy, or can I go big picture for a second?
Yeah, let's go big picture. Feel free to start us off. Yeah,
I think Risacher is compelling to me because his game fits together really well for a complementary player at the NBA level. And I'm not going to say that's like the best complementary player in there, but like he makes good decisions. He works hard. I like both his motor and his athleticism relative to like the average player. And I wish his wingspan were bigger. And the limitations he has seem likely to keep him from stardom and superstardom for me. And where that puts him in relative to the rest of this class is something that takes more time as we discuss and evaluate the rest of this class. But what I like about him is the idea that I understand how he fits in on a successful team, even if it's more likely as not the best player on that team.
let's go back to his fit. I just had a couple other things I want to say first,
Sure.
because I mean, let's to talk about kind of the star equity first. If we're talking about, and I agree with your assessment that I don't think that that's a likely outcome from him. We should have mentioned too. I think he's pretty decent on the boards. Like he'll try to
Yeah.
sneak, like he always tries to box out. He'll try to like sneak in on the offensive glass, like do some swim moves, see if he can be effective there. So again, it fits in with him
Yeah.
being a guy who plays hard. And I
Seven
think
per,
he's, yeah,
7% offensive rebound rate for somebody who mostly stands in the perimeter and shoots catches threes is actually pretty good.
absolutely. So, and he's going to be a guy I'm really going to enjoy watching. Like he makes quick decisions. He can fit into like a free flowing system extremely well. And, I think he's not going to be a guy who has like a bunch of weaknesses on the offensive end. But if I'm really going to say, how does this guy going to become a star? I think the only way is if he becomes like an elite shot maker. Because I just don't, and can be, become like, almost like a Michael Porter Jr. sort of level of shooter. I mean, I think that's, and like he's got pretty good footwork on it. Like he's, for being his age, like it's coming along, but you don't love the free throw shooting at this point. You don't think that that's a
Yeah,
likely
and
outcome, but I could see it.
and broadly speaking, I like Risacher's off-ball movement as well, and so that's something
Oh,
that
it's
kind of
great. It's great.
dovetails into this.
Yeah, and he's really good at like setting up screens. Like he really is like wise beyond his years in a lot of ways, and I enjoyed that. So you talked about his fit. Okay, so he probably has to be a third option offensively. This is kind of more like likeliest outcome
Yes.
rather than upside. I think maybe he could be a second option if he's like becomes like amazing shooter. And then on defense, so you're talking about a wing that's a third option, but probably like at best guarding like the second best perimeter threat and maybe even having to be third. Now he could be part of your team defense. That's all. That's nice. Like, again, I don't think he's going to be like a massive liability, but also if he gets switched on to Luka Doncic, you're probably going to have to come help, right? Like, or most like really good wings. I don't think he's going to be like getting over a screen, shutting guys down. If you run pick and roll at him with a quick guard, I think you're going to need to give him some help. Yeah, like I don't think you're going to want him switching on to main perimeter offensive threats. That fit is actually like I mean, he's going to be a good player. I mean, he'll probably get a nice second contract, but I do kind of wonder just like on a really high end team, I don't know if he fits in that well, right? And I think he kind of reminds me, like, I'll throw some comps out there now. This is the draft that this has been compared to, and I'll see if I agree once I go through all the guys. But I think if this guy's being talked about in the top 5, I'd kind of have an idea where this might be going. That, like, Otto Porter in 2013, where, like, Otto Porter, he made himself actually into a pretty good shooter. I don't think that Risacher has the defensive length of Porter. Might have a little quicker feet, a little quicker in transition, more ball skills. But kind of a guy who's just, still a third option on offense and just not someone that you ever felt comfortable putting on the best guys. They had to do it, right? Because it was John Wall and Bradley Beal and him. And I think he may end up just having to get pressed into service on guys that you probably just don't really want him guarding in the end, because there just aren't enough threes to go around, and he's the 3, and that's just who the 3 has to guard. But to have him be your in a situation where he's your best defensive player, like, you're just not going to be that good. And early career Batum, we think of Batum now as like he had this renaissance in 2021 with the Clippers, where he kind of morphed into more of like a 4, even a 5, and he had this rim protection. But back when he was with the Blazers, he was kind of in that same boat, right? Like third perimeter offensive option. He was kind of a number 3 with Wes Matthews on the LaMarcus Aldridge Dame teams. And, kind of looked the part maybe of a defensive stopper and had to guard those guys, but he wasn't necessarily. Like, Wes Matthews really had to be that guy more than him. So I think like that sort of player is probably where we end up. But, also Nick Batum and Otto Porter Jr. both got like $120 million contracts,
Yeah.
which was a ton of money at the time. So that's like that kind of, because the world needs threes.
Positional scarcity is a very real thing, and this has come up a lot over the years, both with this show and on Real GM Radio, about rolling the dice on threes and fours versus other positions. And there'll be some of those macro conversations with this class that will inevitably come. And with Risacher, and then the real fascinating part to me is the idea of like, well, how could it be better and how could it be worse? You brought up the like potentially if he can be more of a shooter, or potentially, like I brought up the idea that he could develop more of a pull-up game and theoretically kind of get a little bit with it. I think that's less likely. It is possible. And the ways that it couldn't work is just that his athleticism is a little worse than we thought that it was, and the wingspan becomes a bigger problem. And so he's more of you brought up Gordon Hayward back when he could defend. Maybe he's more like Gordon Hayward when he couldn't defend as well. And it's a possibility.
Yeah, maybe even more like kind of Celtics Hayward than Utah
sure.
Hayward.
Exactly. And so then at that point, then you're like, well, crap. Or like, I mean, I think he's better than Cam Johnson, but the idea that like when a player gets kind of below a threshold, then they have to be really good at other stuff that Risacher is positive in, but isn't superlative in. And so then he has to kind of get there, development, everything else like that. And so it's a concern. And I'm fully confident that Risacher will be a rotation level of player, especially when you consider the scarcity at the position. But there is also a point where a starter that you want to upgrade on or a high-end reserve is valuable, but not that valuable. And the idea that...
Yeah. Well, I don't know that he's even a starter that you want to upgrade on for most teams. It's just he's also going to actually potentially, like, especially if he does score reasonably well, like Tobias Harris is kind of might be like another analog for him, like different sort of player, but maybe like, that level of player. We're like, yeah, he could do some stuff scoring, like, maybe he's not that bad defensively. And like, so I think he's going to end up getting paid a lot, but you're also going to sort of be like, man, like if this guy is one of our top 3 highest played players, like how good are we? I think he ends up in like the sort of, that 13 to 20 range among small forwards, which again is an exceedingly valuable player, right? Like OG Anunoby is our number 12 small forward, and Devin Vassell was I shouldn't say is mine, and Devin Vassell is like my number 18. Like, so like those are good players. Those are guys who are getting 9-figure contracts. So like I think he's gonna be like, my most likely outcome is that's the type of player he's gonna be, and that's a good player. But it's also just, I mean, like Otto Porter got drafted in the top 3. That actually he was one of the better guys drafted in that 2013 top 10.
So I invoked Brandon Miller earlier, and you wanted to talk about him later.
I did. I mean, how do you think he compares to Brandon Miller? Is he at all in the same league?
At all, yes. But Miller, to me, he had more intrigue on the ball, and had more, like, there were more moments of like interesting athleticism. Not that Miller is transcendent or anything like that as an athlete. Like I brought up, there were times, like I was looking back at my Miller notes today after I finished on Risacher, and like I had brought up in Miller's notes that there were times in the film that he reminded me of Duke Tatum, not Celtics Tatum, but Duke Tatum, and I never really got that from Risacher. So I think that there was another level there. But if I think we're kind of, they're within each other's bands pretty clearly. But I think that Miller is a little bit better. Even if I like the way that Risacher sees and feels the game better, that's a part of the story, not the whole story.
Yeah, and he is a year younger than Miller when he was drafted as well. But to me, Miller, like I actually thought Miller, I liked Scoot better than him, and I liked Demen better than him. That's not, neither of those is looking like a great assessment right now, but I thought he was like a totally decent guy to be picked number 2 in like a normal draft. I wouldn't say that about Risacher, because I think Miller, like he'd shown an elite skill in college of like taking deep threes, taking threes off of screens. He showed some pretty decent pick and roll ability, pick and roll passing ability, little bit of floaters. Like I do think they have some similar athletic limitations, but Miller has a little bit more length as well. I think he's showed a little bit more defensive potential, even if Risacher just plays harder and has more feel, as you kind of noted. And like I think Miller, he's a little thin. Like Risacher is actually probably a little bigger frame than him, but Miller I think is probably going to shoot it well enough that you could just play him at the 2 even if you wanted to, right? Whereas Risacher, I don't think. I mean, he might get there, but for Miller, I was like, yeah, this is totally reasonable that he's going to just be one of the better shooters at his size, and then you've just got an all-star. Whereas like not a high-end all-star, but an all-star. And I just like Risacher, that outcome to me seems just much more remote. And I like Miller's ball skills a lot more. And maybe if Risacher had grown up in the US and was just being given the ball all the time at AAU, he would be better at this type of stuff, and maybe he can develop it. But I just don't. I haven't even really seen flash. I didn't really see flash of that at the Hoop Summit, So I'm like definitely a good player, but I'm just kind of like I think I've said enough on him basically at this point. So I'm very interested to see how he's going to stack up with some of these other guys.
Mm-hmm.